Hello, everyone. Getting everything set up here. All right. I don't know. Hearing myself in two places. Okay, cool. Awesome. Let me just get my notes up here. Cool. You guys are welcome to comment as we go. It's always nice to get feedback and hear who's watching. And yeah, if you have any questions or just experiences that you want to share with everyone, please feel free to comment. I might not get to it at the time, but I will always go back later and comment on anything that I didn't comment on. So hello, I am Sarah, health and career coach for women clinicians. And this is one of the topics that I think comes up a lot in different ways. And we'll get into that a little bit now. I asked the question on Instagram and on the Facebook group, like, I think the one question was just rating how authentic you feel you can be at work, and rating that from 1 to 10. And then the other one being just, do you feel like most of the time you can be authentic, or most of the time not, or completely not, or I can be completely authentic? So most people kind of answered a little bit in between. So either most of the time I can, or most of the time I can't, but no one, or kind of like a 6 on the scale. One person did, I think, give a 1, but that was in the past. And yeah, so we're mostly kind of in the space where we don't necessarily feel that we can never be authentic at work, or that we can always be authentic at work, but we're somewhere in between. And I'd love to hear as well from you where you kind of sit on that, either in terms of a scale, or just in terms of like, do you feel that most of the time you can be authentic, or most of the time you can't be authentic? And just getting an idea of like where you kind of feel with that. And it may be different with, for example, patients versus colleagues. And that can be an interesting thing to look at, you know, like where is that difference coming from? So you're welcome to say, you know, with patients, I feel like I can be authentic, you know, some of the time or none of the time. Whereas with colleagues, I feel like I can be completely authentic. And you can also then start to think about like, when you're not at work, right? Like, is this something that goes into the rest of your life as well? Like, do you generally feel like you can't really be very authentic in your life? Like, is that a general thing, or is it specifically about work? And then you get to explore like where, what is different about work, right? What is different between patients and colleagues? What is different between your relationships with your friends versus your partner? Whatever it is, like wherever there are discrepancies, you can start to get an idea of like what is different about that, and why do I struggle with one or the other? But then also getting a sense of like, maybe this is just a general thing, right? Like I struggle to be authentic in all my relationships, and that's definitely true. In some cases, I definitely felt like that, you know, a couple of years ago. And then it would get more specific. So you can really kind of dive into those things, and you're welcome to comment, you know, what you discover as you kind of think through those questions. So I wanted to read some of the responses that I got on the questions about it. And it'll just help to kind of start the discussion on it, but also if you resonate with any of these, just type in a yes. Okay, so if I see a colleague's patient, I feel like I have to mold to what the patient is used to. And then this was something that made her feel inauthentic. With very strongly opinionated colleagues, I would rather blend in than cause a fuss. If I'm in a great mood, then I can be authentic with patients or colleagues. But if I'm having a bad day, then I can't be authentic. With patients, I can't show them that I'm having a bad day because they're paying for me to show up and help them. With my colleagues, I don't want to be negative or complain all the time and like bring down, you know, the energy of the practice or the room. I'm a big introvert at the practice, but I try to be as extroverted as I can be. I just found I spend too much of my energy trying to be what I think patients wanted me to be. So this was someone that had in the past felt very inauthentic and now quite authentic in practice. So the shift that she described was, in the past, she spent all this energy trying to be what she thought her patients wanted her to be, and that's what she had been kind of letting go of. Another one was, I was vulnerable or authentic, and it actually backfired, or it didn't get the response that I wanted to get. Another one was, you know, feeling really drained, but then having to put on this like facade of like, I'm caring and I'm empathic. And so, yeah, those were kind of the types of responses. I'd love to know if there are any that you would add to this. Just thinking of a situation at work where you feel that you can't be authentic. Okay, so the question arises when we hear all these responses, right? The answers vary quite a bit, right? So the question is, what does it actually mean to be authentic then, right? If some people mean it as, I'm being honest about what I think, other people talk about it as, when I'm feeling a certain way, that I don't have to pretend. Maybe it's sometimes like showing a different side of your personality than you maybe wanted to show. Sometimes it's putting on a completely different persona, right? Like, this is what they want me to be, so I'm going to be that person, even though it doesn't feel like me. So this is something that you can think of for yourself. Like, how do you define being authentic? Because we use that word a lot, and usually we give the very kind of vague thing of just like, be yourself. And you know, it's like, which self, right? Sometimes we are slightly different people in different situations, right? Sometimes we might have a situation where we actually are more extroverted, and other situations where we are most introverted. Maybe we had a certain self-concept and way of behaving in the past, and do we then have to always behave that same way? Like, can we ever change? Can our self change, right? So thinking about, how would you define authenticity? Is it about being always honest and sincere, right? Like, if someone asks you something and you are not ready to share that, is it then actually authentic to share it? Because then you're being honest, right? Or is it actually then authentic to say, I don't want to share that, or just not engaging, right? So another kind of definition that would come up is it just expressing in every single moment, like letting people know how you're feeling in every moment, right? Like updating people all the time, like, this is how I feel. And thinking about, like, is that actually what you want to be doing? Like, if that's what authenticity is, like, is that what you want to be doing all the time? Is it about honoring your values, right? Is it about being true to what you value? What if the value is changing in that particular moment, right? Like, just to use a very extreme example, but let's say one of your values is honesty, right? But in this particular situation, you have to tell a lie in order to save someone's life, whatever. But in that moment, what is then your value, right? What if different periods of your life, different things were important to you? Do your values always stay the same, right? So it becomes a little bit kind of murky. Like, when we're saying, I can't be authentic with my patients or with my colleagues, what do you actually mean by that, right? So that's an important thing to get really clear of. And then one of the things I asked one of the clinicians is, does it actually bother you? And the reason I asked this is, it doesn't always create, let's say, psychological discomfort when we are inauthentic. So let's say, for example, you're at your dentist and the dentist asks, how are you doing? You don't then go, I have to share what my true feelings are and how my day is going. Otherwise, I'm not being authentic. Right? You might just, give them a kind of vague answer, like, yeah, I'm doing great, and not have any problem with it, right? So sometimes it doesn't bother us because we don't necessarily find it important to be honest about how we're feeling, or it just feels like, what is the point of necessarily talking about how I genuinely feel in this moment, right? So sometimes it just doesn't bother us that we are, quote unquote, inauthentic, right? If some drunken man walks up to you and asks you about like your childhood, you're not going to feel inauthentic if you don't tell him your whole life story. It's like some random person that you don't even know, right? So that's something to really get clear on, is like, there are times in our life where being necessarily where we're not being necessarily like vulnerable about all our feelings and thoughts and life story and telling the whole truth and all these kind of things. Sometimes that's just not important to us, or what do you call it? It doesn't suit that situation, right? So the question is, does it bother you, right? So not only looking at, am I being inauthentic, but is there some discomfort around that? And there are two main reasons it might become uncomfortable. So the one is emotional labor. So this is where we are having to almost like create an emotion that we're not really feeling. So this is the emotional labor that many helpers will feel, healthcare providers, clinicians. We will all have to have that kind of emotional labor of, maybe you don't feel particularly joyful, but you feel like you have to give this persona of like, I'm enthusiastic and I'm joyful and I'm always happy, because that's what you feel your patient needs to have, or what you feel the standard is. Maybe you having to like look like you're really interested, and look like you compassionate and empathetic, and have these sort of like emotional cues to the patient to let them know you're listening and you care, when maybe that's not exactly how you're feeling, right? So anywhere where there's a gap between what we're feeling and the emotions and the behaviors we have to exhibit, that is emotional labor. So if we're thinking about emotional labor, this can go back to that example of like, the patient is paying me to show up for them and to care about them, and I feel exhausted, or I feel not truly like I in that moment particularly like can get that empathic, like I care and I'm compassionate and all that kind of stuff, or I have energy. So in that emotional labor, we always have choices, right? If you think about that gap between what you are genuinely feeling and what is expected of you in that moment, you can either close that gap, right, between what you're feeling and what is expected. And you can do that in two ways, right? You can either lower what you feel is expected of you, right? Maybe you start to question, like, do I always need to be high energy and enthusiastic and like looking like I care, and I'm have this like motherly look about me? Like, especially women have a very high standard of expectation, whether that's from them or other people, right? But we have this standard of like, what does it look like to look like a caring person? So you might look at that standard and think, is that really necessary? All right, is that taking away from care? Is that me being a less good healthcare professional if I'm just not overly enthusiastic or joyful, or whatever it is, whatever you are thinking that it would be for you to look authentic, right? What is that level? And questioning whether that's actually what's expected or what's necessary, or whether you are thinking that that's what the patient wants or that's what the patient needs. Because if you think about it as well, if you are on the other side of that, you might want a healthcare provider who's a little bit more human, and who isn't just all the time kind of faking this over the top caring and enthusiastic and whatever personality, right? So let's look at what is that level that we expect, and starting to question that. The other way to close that gap, right, would be you feeling better, right? So you would genuinely feel better, you would genuinely have more energy, you would genuinely feel more compassionate towards your patient, you would genuinely feel more enthusiastic or whatever it is. And maybe that's where the work needs to come from, right? Like maybe we need to look at, like, why are you feeling so low on energy? Why are you feeling so, like, for example, if someone has this kind of history of always giving more than they can, and it feels like you're taken advantage of, and you feel like people aren't grateful, or you feel like you give so much to yourself and you don't get anything back, there can be so much to that you feel that you're not really, so when you feel like you're not really that person that can do that, all right, so you are lessening that gap by how you feel rather than by that expectation. So that would be emotional labor. The other thing that we can do when we have that emotional labor, right, that gap between what I'm feeling and what I feel I have to show, we can also be very aware that we are expending that emotional labor. So being very conscious of the fact that, okay, today I expended a lot of emotional labor, right? I was conscious of it. I did it for a certain reason, but now I have to recover from that. So designing recovery from emotional labor into our lives. Those are all ways that we can deal with emotional labor. The other reason why we might care about being inauthentic, right, especially if it comes from like, I have to be a different kind of person, or I have to, if I'm an introvert, but now I have to pretend to be an extrovert, or all of those kinds of feeling inauthentic can lead to us feeling like who we are as people are just not, it's not enough, right? Either this is not the correct career for us because we have to be someone completely different, or maybe we're just always going to be not that great at it, or maybe we see a certain part of ourselves as just not acceptable. So there's a term called like self-abandonment. So you can have this discomfort around inauthenticity because you literally feel like I'm abandoning who I really am in order to do this job, right? And if you're doing that chronically, you can imagine how that feels, right? Maybe you don't have to imagine, maybe that's your experience, right? So you can imagine that would be uncomfortable. Whereas someone who, goes to work and they don't have any particular story around, just being bubbly and nice and to everyone, and they don't really have this like, this desire even to share their authentic thoughts and feelings and whatever with the patient. They don't have that same narrative of I'm literally abandoning who I am in order to do this job, right? And then one of the other aspects why we might care about the fact that we're being inauthentic is this question of choice. We might feel like it's literally like we don't have any choice in this, right? This is just what the job requires. This is what I have to do in order for me to do this job, right? This is what my patients require from me. This is what my boss requires from me. There can be an element of feeling out of control and like you don't have a choice in this. So those are kind of some of the examples. Let me know if any of those, Nikki, you can also give your answers on what you feel like. Sometimes we just don't really, it doesn't bother us that we're being inauthentic, right? Certain situations, certain people, especially when we are closer to someone, when it's, the close people in our life, the more it's important that we are genuinely our authentic self. The more it's kind of like random people, or people we don't know, or people we don't really care about building a relationship, the more we don't really care that we're not, voicing our authentic thoughts and feelings and whatever it is, right? And I think what can happen with work, with colleagues and with patients is that they're kind of a little middle ground, right? They're not quite your close people, but they're not quite like strangers and people that you don't care about. And I think we all have to kind of find that middle ground of like, what does it mean to actually be a human being at work? What does it mean to be still myself? And what does it mean to, perform emotional labor in a way that feels meaningful to us, that we are doing it in service of our patients, in service of their outcomes, and not as this drain on who we are or on our energy levels, right? That it doesn't become about completely being another person because who we are authentically is not enough or is not appropriate, right? So I think that's also why it can become quite a tricky thing, is because they're kind of in this middle ground. So one of the things I wanted you to kind of like reflect about authenticity is, who is it actually for? So if you are looking to be authentic, what is the purpose of it, right? Like, who are you being authentic for? Because one of the things that someone answered was, I was authentic about my feelings and my thoughts, and it sort of backfired, right? It didn't provide the outcome that I expected it to. So the question is, if we are being authentic in order to achieve a certain thing, is that really being authentic, right? Who is it actually for? And who is the inauthenticity for as well? Because we think of it as, I'm being inauthentic, in service of my patients, or because whoever I am is not enough, so I need to be a certain type of person for the patient or for the colleague or whatever it is, right? And if you think about, let's say you bring up a situation in your mind, right? Let's think of a time that you felt like you couldn't be authentic at work. And I want you to imagine doing the opposite, right? So let's say, I'm just going to go back to this example, right? Let's say you were seeing your colleague's patient, and you just decided, I'm not going to mold to what this patient is used to. I'm going to do exactly what I think is appropriate and what I believe in and what I want to do, right? What feels really uncomfortable about that? Like, what are you dreading? What are you not wanting to feel? What outcome do you not want to have, right? The example of having opinionated colleagues, I would rather blend in than cause a fuss, right? Let's say you just said whatever you wanted to say. Let's say you took up space. Let's say you went head on with that strongly opinionated colleague, right? What feels uncomfortable about that? What are you dreading if you had to do that, right? If you show up at work and with patients as like this person that's complaining all the time, and you have, you're like, you don't look that enthusiastic to be there. You maybe don't look like you care that much when someone tells you about their pain or whatever it is, right? What would feel so uncomfortable about being that person, right? Because this is what I want to just emphasize, that sometimes it's about us and not about the other person, right? Sometimes we are not doing it because they need it, or that's what's better for them, or that's what they need, or whatever it is. Sometimes we're doing it to protect ourselves, right? We're protecting ourselves from some kind of discomfort, some kind of emotional state that we don't want to feel, some kind of identity that we don't want to take on. So think about it, who it's for, what is the purpose of it, right? Do you have a choice in it? Is it what you think others need from you, or do you genuinely know that that's what would benefit them the most? Is it for you? Is it for them, right? Is it a habitual behavior that you've just learned to do and that has gotten you quite far, but now is not going to help you for where you want to go, right? If you are on the other side of that interaction, if you were the person receiving care, how would you want your healthcare provider to show up, right? And then think about like, what is the actual benefit of being more human and more real, right? Because we think about it as, oh, I have to be inauthentic because that's what people want. But what is the benefit of being a little bit more human, a little bit more real? So we've chatted a lot about a lot of different like reflection questions. I know that can be a lot, but it's all just to have like, maybe one of these things just resonates with what you're experiencing, and you can go and reflect on that. You don't need to go through every single one of these questions, but just to have that, you sort of start to examine a little bit from different angles. So Adam Grant, there's this quote, one of the things he said was, nobody wants to hear everything that's in your head, right? So there's this idea of unhealthy authenticity and healthy authenticity. Unhealthy authenticity is kind of, like I said, it's based on things like being safe, right? You're trying to avoid getting fired, or you're trying to avoid losing patients. You're trying to protect yourself. You're trying to avoid a certain kind of emotion, right? It's about a relationship, right? You are doing it because you don't want them to judge you in a specific way, or you think it's going to do something to the relationship, or your self-esteem, your self-image, your status, how you see yourself, right? I'm a caring person, I'm optimistic, I don't complain, or I am, someone who doesn't complain, or is always enthusiastic, or is optimistic. Trying to think about the other examples. Like maybe you are someone who is changing in terms of your values and your personality and what you care about, but you're afraid to do that because changing who you are is going to, lose certain patients that like the way that you are, right? Or you're trying to you want to change your beliefs about your beliefs have changed about how you want to practice, and you want to practice a different way, but you're worried about disappointing patients, right? Is protective. Some or other like self-esteem or self status or image that you're worried about being threatened, right? Whereas healthy authenticity, healthy authenticity comes from you, right? And it's getting comfortable with who you are, getting connected with how you feel about things, what you believe about things, and being willing to show up like that person, right? And the original definition of authenticity, it came from the Greek word authenteios, which meant that which you do with your own hands. And I think for healthy authenticity, we want to think about self-authorship, right? We want to think about choice and responsibility. We want to think about me sitting down and developing my own philosophy about authenticity, about what I want to portray to my patients, right? Maybe I really believe and value the idea that we as healthcare providers need to show up more as human beings. I actually want to let my patients know when I'm not having a great day, because I feel that that's important to start normalizing that healthcare providers also don't have a great day, right? I want to normalize the fact that we don't always have to be overly enthusiastic and whatever and put on this facade, and we still can give incredible care to our patients, right? We don't have to put on this face, right? So you are deciding what is important to you. You are self-authoring this authentic you, right? It's not your patient is demanding that, or your work is demanding that. There's choice in it, right? There's responsibility in it as well. And you get to, develop your own philosophy on what is actually important to you, and how do you want to show up at work? What is authenticity to you? What is being the person that you want to be at work? What is that? What is going to bring your patients the best outcomes, and how do you achieve that, right? One of the things that drains us less when it comes to emotional labor is if that is meaningful to us, right? So for example, if I one of the things that I tend to do is like I just give facts about something. So I try to just educate my patients. And as clinician, as a fellow clinician, you might know that with some people, that's just not very effective, right? If we are genuinely wanting the best outcomes for a patient, we have to sometimes veer from what we would just naturally, authentically do. And I have to then get better at, how do I tell this as a story? How do I find an analogy that maybe makes sense to this particular patient, right? Maybe how do I tell this with more simplicity? How do I maybe bring more energy into it if it's someone that struggles to concentrate and they maybe need a little bit of higher energy, right? If I'm performing that emotional labor because that is going to bring the best outcomes for my patient, I can find meaning in that and it's not going to drain me as much. Whereas if I have the story that I'm doing this because I have to, because who I am is not enough at work, or because they are so, patients want this or have to have this, or my work requires this, or whatever it is, you can see how our narrative behind the emotional labor affects significantly how much that's going to be draining of us. So the goal here is not just being honest about all your feelings, or always telling people when you have a bad day, or always complaining when you feel like you want to complain, or being just like a quiet introvert when maybe at certain times it's appropriate to be a different way, right? Authenticity is not about all those things. It's self-authorship. It's true authenticity to who you want to be, who you've decided you are being, and being willing to develop your own philosophy about what it means to be authentic. What is the meaning making that you have behind authenticity and showing up with patients or colleagues, right? So we want to think about, like, where is your biggest work? And then we can decide on like a little action that can take you closer to that. So where is your biggest work? Is it being willing or learning to be more, to sit with uncomfortable feelings? So in other words, is your work, I need to learn how to act in a way that's true to myself, and being willing to handle the criticism, handle the judgment, handle pressure from others to be different, right? Is that where your work is? Do you tend to numb out and distract yourself, dissociate, right? Are you always trying to avoid the discomfort that comes from being a way that other people maybe didn't expect or don't want? Is your biggest work maybe that you've never really sat down and thought about what is your own philosophy on being authentic, right? Is your work deciding for yourself, this is what it means to be authentic, this is what my values are, this is how I want to show up, and this is why it's important, even when that might not be what other people want from me, or what other people think that I should have. It's how, essentially, is your work self-authoring your own version of authenticity? Or is it trying to find more meaning around your emotional labor, right? So looking at where you have a gap between what you feel and where you want to go, or where you think that patients or colleagues or whatever need you to be. And that gap, can you either, build in recovery behaviors to recover from that emotional labor? Is it to reduce your expectations of what the patient needs or expects, or your colleagues or your work? Is it to yourself feel better about work, right? Is there some like underlying, thing that's draining your energy, or some reason that you're so unhappy that you have to fill up that gap to be more, enthusiastic? Or can you make meaning around that emotional labor and say, yes, I'm expending this emotional labor, but it's because I've decided this is what is necessary to get, the best outcomes for my patients, or to be the healthcare provider that I genuinely want to be. Or this is, in this particular case with this particular patient, what is most effective from them, right? Is that your work, that emotional labor? And then you can see like, where is your work? Where is the thing that you need to work on the most? And how can you just take a 5-minute action that is in that direction, right? So we're not going to, from one day to the other, suddenly like revolutionize this thing about authenticity at work, right? But once you've identified which direction do you need to grow in, just choose a 5-minute action that you can do towards that. And usually the safest, most accessible is just to journal about that idea, right? Like just take that idea and just journal about it for a few minutes, right? Maybe it's choosing a 5-minute part of your patient consult where you're not expecting yourself to be anything different than you are. Maybe it's those 5 minutes where you're like trying to make small talk because you feel awkward, that it's awkward silence, uncomfortable, there's awkward silence. Maybe you just allow yourself to feel that awkwardness. And maybe that's your practice for the week, right? So yeah, let me know what your actions will be. Sorry, I think it's 5 minutes. Let me know what your 5 minutes actions are, and we can help each other and come up with ideas for each other, and also help each other with being accountable for those 5-minute actions. Awesome. Have a great Sunday, and let me know any questions or any reflections, anything that you'd like to hear more about in the future. Have a good Sunday, guys. Sorry, I was struggling to end things.